when we are choosing to incarnate, we usually have a generalized intent for what we want to achieve here. And if there's specific events that need to occur for that intent to come to fruition, then we make things like pre-incarnation agreements, where we're going to meet certain people, we're going to be certain places, certain times. And none of these are set in stone, but they're basically, we're making agreements energetically between people that are incarnating maybe in the same group we are, or that already are incarnate here. And there's an agreement to run into each other, or to at least recognize that person when you meet. So there's a lot that goes on before we incarnate for what we want to do here. The thing that I found that we don't really tend to do is pick like a job. What we're doing is picking an intent for how we're going to express our frequency once we incarnate. So if we want to work with people, we could work with people as an auto mechanic, or we could work with people as a nurse. But it's the interacting with people and helping them fix something might be the intent. So there's a big difference between life purpose as how we're expressing and interacting with people and what kind of job we end up with, or if we work at a university or work as a janitor or whatever it is. It doesn't matter, usually to the in this incarnate spirit, that specific. The other things are probability structures. So if I have an intent that I want to shake up a certain system here, let's say, there's something that I feel there needs to be an opening in the consciousness on the planet, on a specific bandwidth that I'm familiar with as a disincarnate spirit. I will find the probabilities to where I can work. So that might mean incarnating into a certain part of the country, or incarnating into a certain race for that matter, because maybe I want to, free a certain group or a certain female or male dynamic or something. So I will choose a probability of incarnation that is going to help further that. And there's also free will. So once we get incarnate, things change dramatically. So sometimes what we thought we saw is not the actual on the ground reality. So then what happens is we start moving in and out of how do we have our intent for incarnation still occur, knowing that not only do we have our free will and how we're going to incarnate, but the people around us are going to influence that too. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the personality versus soul. So we all have a distinct essence that you can call our soul or our frequency in the bandwidth of, all that is, God, or however you want to use that term. And as we incarnate, we develop a distinct personality that is unique to this lifetime only. And that personality is never duplicated. So even though you might be the reincarnation of King Arthur or something, and everybody else seems to be the reincarnation of King Arthur too, what they're talking about is a part of your soul essence had that reincarnation. But that doesn't mean you're that personality, because personalities don't reincarnate, only soul essence does. So every time you're born, your personality is new. And we'll get into that a little bit more, but not to say that it's not influenced by those events, it is. But it's distinct to this particular incarnation. Now, when you get into life purpose, a lot of people feel lost because sometimes the personality becomes disengaged from the soul essence to a point where they no longer feel the drive of why they incarnated. And so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit, is how do you get those two back into alignment? Because they're not in opposition in my view. I have no problem with ego. The problem is when it doesn't realize what it's being fueled from, and those two are no longer enmeshed. So you have to have personality to bring spirit into the world, or else the two are divorced. In my view. People have different views of that, but that's the way I see it. Higher self chaperoning. There are levels of experience that people choose. And some essence wants an experience where they are in control of their experience more than others. So they tend to be spiritualists, they tend to really question realities, they tend to want to break things up and rearrange stuff. And they tend to have what some would consider more difficult life decisions because they can't go along with the herd, because they have too much knowledge of how reality works. There are other essences that are only here for pure experience, and they want that experience to be chaperoned. So basically their higher self takes care of all their decision making. So they tend to join a big group, and things tend to go really easily for them within the current cultural reality system, because that is what they've chosen to experience. And as that goes, they might reach a point where they're thinking, I want to branch out of that because I want to have a little bit more evolutionary experience this time around than I originally intended. And then they'll start thinking of other things. So a lot of it has to do is certain essence intends to change things dramatically, and they come in very complicated. Other essence is here just for experience. They come in what we consider very simple, only because they're basically being chaperoned by a higher aspect of themselves. That just makes things line up for them. Now, that sounds great and all, but if your intent is to be a co-creator of reality, you have to have experiences that force you to co-create. And that really puts you in the driver's seat, and it can make your life seem difficult, but it's actually putting you in positions where you can create different reality structures and know that for later on, or even in this incarnation, depending on what your intent is. So when you incarnate in, there's a number of things that are affecting how your personality develops, or who you become in this life, let's say. And so one that a lot of people have connections to are past lives. So in other words, there's influences from events that have occurred that get recreated within this life, in either large ways or small ways. There's dimensional selves, and those, I'll get into those a little bit more in depth later too, but selves that are living parallel with you in what we consider this timeline, and they can have direct influence on you. Soul groups, and I'm using that as if a particular block of essence, or you can go into things like if you're from a particular group, some people say they're from the Palladians or from wherever else, that can have a large influence on what you feel you want to do because that group has an agenda and you're a representative of that group, so you're here to do a particular thing. There's also fairy groups, and there's some earth elemental groups that have purposes. They're trying to get those realities to be more clear here, so they incarnate into human form to make it part of the cultural dynamic. So if you get enough collective consciousness, you'll be able to see fairies again, things like that. Same with UFO groups do that too. They're trying to get back into the reality structure so we can interact again. And then we have incarnational family patterning. So what happens is, even if you're from way off in a different universe and you're just here on a one-time incarnation, as soon as you incarnate into a family lineage, there's a whole set of genetic information that gets downloaded, and that's consciousness. So you're getting consciousness patterns from both sides of your family and from your descendants if we go through the time thing. And all of that, you become locked into this web of consciousness base. So you're connecting to the lineage of this planet, all of the family things going back. You have opportunities to clear some of those things within that family. And it gives you a grounded earth reality, because without it, you would just be floating around in your own reality structure that probably knows nothing of Earth, and you wouldn't have any way to learn language or to do any of the things that we do as babies so quickly. But as you drop in, you're actually developing into that lineage consciousness. We can get into it a little bit more too. So as you set your intent for what you want to do in your life before you incarnate, you want to make the most of each incarnation. So that consciousness has an intent that they want to either learn a certain thing about this reality here on Earth, so they're what you might call vacationers. They're here to explore what's Earth reality like, what is the physicality here like. Or they might have a direct objective, like the Palladian sent me here to make a light beam for somebody, or whatever it is. There's a number of different things they're here to do. To make it the most effective, your essence at that level is infinite, because you're still directly tied to the Tao, basically, all that is. And so what happens then is you funnel it in, and it hits that point, incarnational point, it then funnels back out. And so you start creating dimensional lives. So you get parallel lives going sideways, you get parallel lives going back and forward in time, so past lives. You also get what I would call duplicate incarnational lives. So people that are actually alive, but they have almost a split essence of yours. And some people actually come as a group of essence so they can really experience everything here from slightly different vantage points, but with the same general idea. People tend to join large groups where everybody's thinking the same, because that's kind of where they feel comfortable. They're not individual. Now, as that consciousness spreads, it builds up your format here, so that as you incarnate in, all of a sudden all these past lives start filling in. And so you have all of these resources to work with and knowings to work with. And this is where you get into essence allocation. So people tend to allocate essence where it's useful in the intent of the personality in this particular life. So as an example, let's say you decide to be an architect. Then you might pull a past life that built a cathedral somewhere closer in, and therefore you're drawing on a knowing. Very obvious examples are child prodigies. They're very close to essence that's already mastered something, very close to them. And so they can instantly bring it in because their intent is to get farther than what that essence got in that particular life. So there's essence allocation going on. Some people, I don't want to get too complex here, but there's people that are so airy that they can't seem to get anything accomplished in the physical here. And that tends to be because they have so many past lives and are so diversified in their essence that they have a lot of knowing but not much will necessarily in this particular world. Because they've spread their knowledge out among a large base because they need a lot of behind-the-scene physics to see the reality structures that are going on. Where there's other people that are very here and they can farm something, make something, but they have no concern about anything beyond what's physically here. And they've allocated their essence in, and they tend to be very, I'm going to say dense in a good word, in a good way. They're very firm, can be very physical, they have hardly any ailments, they're connected to the planet because they're pulled in. And why that's useful is as you're defining how to have your life purpose incarnate in a way that's joyful for you in this world, you have to decide where you want to pull your essence in so that you can make it into something that works for you here. And we'll get into that a little bit later too. Clearing trauma. So as you're connected to past lives, the trauma from those lives are affecting you directly. And since there's no time, that it has a direct effect. So a lot of people have phobias that can be considered past life phobias of snakes or whatever because they're still being eaten by a snake pretty close by. They also have interactions with people that are instantly either love or hate because in a different reality structure, those two essences are having either a battle or some kind of, they could be married or whatever. They're running into somebody who's like, oh my God, I love that person. You want somebody else and I want to kill them, but you have no idea why. And there's a lot of these things going on that as you step out of this reality's view of things, I call it going like a dimension over, you can see then, oh, I can see how I'm tied to essence somewhere, and they're tied to essence somewhere, and I can diffuse it. So there's a lot of little tricks we can do dimensionally to kind of make here more useful for our intent. Utilizing gifts and resources is what I talked about earlier, is you can tie into past lives, parallel lives that have knowledge or abilities that you need. And it's not going to be a direct transfer unless they're really close in, but you can set an intent and then actually go out and say, oh, it's almost like I know how to do this, but you can actually pull that energy so you really know how to do it when you need to do it. So you can actually utilize your dimensional selves in different ways to create what your intent is in this particular reality. Okay, so on the other side then, we have the family, and also I say incarnational patterning because you're incarnating into a culture, and that culture is going to have patterning. So if I was born in the United States versus if I was born in sub-Saharan Africa, I'm going to have a completely different culturalization. And that has its own set of patterns and possibilities of how you want to live your life too. So I'd say breaking evolving lineage patterning, the idea is a lot of that patterning is stuck in very defined energetic ruts for specific purposes. A lot of it was used to incarnate people into an experience that was very well defined so they could have an experience of Earth that was very systematic from birth to death. And that's what people wanted. And that's why they incarnated into those systems that were very defined. Now we're breaking those systems so that the Earth itself is changing. The gravity structures are no longer that way. They're not isolated anymore. And so a lot of those structures have to be broken if you want to have a different experience and you want to project how you influence reality differently. You have to know, well, what patterning was I born into? And is that influencing how I'm relating to people in the world? Is this my parents' pattern? Is this my cultural pattern? And so by breaking out of it so you can step back, you can then evolve the entire lineage pattern. So let's say you come from an abusive family pattern. By stepping out of that and evolving it, then literally the descendants, whether they're your descendants or not, of that lineage will then be different. Because you've consciously broken out of a pattern and changed the way it's directed. So that gets into clearing childhood trauma. If we have a specific intent, so if say my intent is to bring understanding of how, I can't think of a good example now. But basically, if I'm trying to change something within cultural, bring awareness to people if there's something different than what they see out there in the world, I have to know what the world is. So I have to incarnate into a family where I am indoctrinated by that family into what the world is. So what it appears to be, what appears to be a horrendous situation to children is indoctrinating them into a particular pattern that they didn't have an opportunity to break. If they weren't in that pattern, they would not understand it and they would have no empathy for somebody that's in it. So if you are born into, say, let's use stereotypes, a poor inner city environment, you have a particular experience of what you are being told you're able to do and what capital you have at your disposal to accomplish something in that reality. And you have somebody that's an affluent person in the suburbs who's always assumed everything comes to them in a particular manner. Things come easily, just you're abundant and whatever. They have, in a direct one-to-one, they have no ability to empathize with that person because they don't understand that their system of creating reality is different than the other person's system of creating reality. So by saying, hey, why don't you just get busy and work harder, they're not even comprehending that the reality structure that person's operating, trying to generate capital from, doesn't work that way at all. It's completely different. So then they'll incarnate into a situation where those particular woundings are placed over them, And then they understand. And then they can go into that life saying, oh, now I understand what has to be broken down in that reality structure to then break back out of it. A little complicated there, but I'm sure it makes sense. So back to life's purpose. For me, the only purpose any of us have is to have our frequency expressed into this world. That's it. Because it doesn't matter what you do here. It doesn't matter even what your personality necessarily is here. But it does matter that your particular frequency, which is uniquely your own, is never going to duplicate, because every incarnation is slightly different. So let's say, let me step back a little bit. So let's have the Tao or God is, sunshine, right? And then you split it through a prism and you're going to get a rainbow of colors. So each of those essences is a particular bandwidth of that frequency. But then how many hues of green are there? In infinite amounts. So you could be one particular hue of green that's incarnating. But as you incarnate in, being in this particular reality slightly changes the hue of that. So the chroma is a little bit different. And so you have a very distinct frequency that you are generating while you're here. Now, as all those frequencies come together, then you recreate the Godhead here, which is what people keep talking about through ascension and heaven and all this junk. But what they're not understanding is the physics behind it is people are incarnating and trying to change their frequency because culture and family patterns and all these other things we talked about, reincarnational patterns, are telling them that it's not okay who you are. You need to alter to be slightly this frequency. Or you need to do slightly this. Or there's no place for you here. Or you can't express who you truly are because there's no place for it in culture, or culture wouldn't accept you, or blah, blah, blah. Well, all of those have distorted all the frequency. People are actually shining behind all these mechanisms of fitting in and being safe and adjusting to patterns of abuse and all these other things. And when you have all that shielding, your frequency doesn't shine. So people, one, can't meet you where you are because you're not there, because your frequency is constantly on a dodge. And so you're not really connecting and then expressing that frequency into the reality, which is what's going to create a different reality structure. Because our whole reality structure now is based on what? Smoke and mirrors, lies. I mean, the whole reality is a manifestation of what we're doing, which is dodging, not being truthful to who we are. All these things. Because we're not expressing our frequency. Because of all those patternings. And I don't think it's wrong that the patternings are there, because I think it's necessary to have gotten our frequency into this reality to then change this reality. You have to be within the jacket to get into the room. But now it's time to undo that and really be truly our frequency. And I believe that is all that life purpose is. Now, how do you want that to manifest and how does that make you happy in your life is the ongoing challenge. And that's the excitement and the adventure of incarnating here. How am I going to make my frequency? Do I want to do that through making art, or do I want to do that through helping others, or how do I want to do that? Do I enjoy being in the background somewhere? But all of it, if you do what you do with your frequency, then you are actually expressing yourself into the world. But it is easier said. Evolving defense mechanisms to gifts. So all of this defense mechanisms that we create as children, because we have things that go bad, and we have to find a way to survive our environments, then lock us down as adults, because we're locked into behavioral patterns, we're locked into auto triggers. Certain situations will automatically trigger us, and they're so ingrained in the brain that it takes a lot of unraveling for most people to even know that what those defense mechanisms are. They just assume that's the way they are. And once you unravel it, you find that what was a gift or a talent in one area has been co-opted to become a defense in another. So what could have been seeing the magic of the world as a gift as a child is now everything sucks, and it's all cynical because now it's become a defense against opening up too much and having somebody slice you off or whatever. So all of these things have been co-opted, and they're like 180s of each other. And when you turn that back around, the most cynical person is usually the most magical person, or was. You can see just how far that mechanism had to go to keep them safe, because they're trying to keep that magic isolated off. So those are what keep you from then expressing that frequency. And as you see them and help unwind those things, your frequency gets stronger and stronger, and those gifts become more part of how your intent then is expressed in the world. Does that make sense? Recovering emotional space. So, without emotional space, you can't contain light. So if you use an electrical, if you have no grounding, you can't hold the charge. So if you have no emotional body, you have nowhere to accept anything, then when you shine light down, it eventually starts to short circuit, and it causes all kinds of physical problems. It causes lack of containment problems. There's all kinds of issues that occur because there's no emotional space to hold light, which is also understanding, which is frequency, which is the ability to know the world. All of those are encapsulated in light. But the emotional body, when it's clear, or you have clearings within it, has a much greater, vast understanding, because it can contain everything. It can contain all light. So you don't have to know anything. You feel everything, and that's instantly translated into what you need. Now, most people have been compressed so dramatically as a child emotionally, or through culture, or through other events, that what they've done is they've started compressing all that emotion in farther and farther and farther, because they don't want to get more and more hurt, so then they get more and more defenses, and eventually the emotional space becomes so compressed that there's no more evolution of the emotional body. It's stuck back where those events occurred. And so then your viewpoint becomes this is dangerous and that's dangerous, and I can't open up to those type of people, and etc. And then you get judgmental systems in place that prove themselves. You know, if I put myself out there, somebody's just going to smack me down because you're opening up your emotional body to encompass a new reality. But you have wounding now, so then somebody does smack you down because you believe that's what's going to happen. So you have all these in play. So there's the duality of the mind has to undo its mechanisms, the emotional body, the heart has to reopen. And you have to move the backlog to contain open space, and then you have new understanding to illuminate that space. And it goes on and on and on until you finally have a large enough space you can recreate your entire reality, not the entire world if you get to that point, because that's all space, emotional space is. So I could emotionally then connect to the entire thing, bring in new light and understanding to it, and create a whole different world. So that's, you know, there's no boundaries to us at that level. We're creating our boundaries because we're shielded, because of what's happening. Utilizing essence connections. So as we're evolving more emotional space, our mind is clear. We start receiving input from other dimensional aspects of ourselves. So we're receiving past life information. We're receiving that there's other dimensions and beings that are communicating with us that we're probably even part of. We're seeing maybe our descendants in the future, or where we're going to go after we disincarnate here. But you can utilize that essence to help bring extra capital here. Because this is I think we're in a particularly compressed environment on this planet. So a little extra light and a little extra emotional help and that web of support helps clear some space so that we can see what our personal path is and where we're headed. And developing links from earth to spirit. So back to the light and emotional containment. if you have no connection to the earth and the grounding, then there's only so much you can bring in from spirit because there's nowhere to hold it. So people have been drawn one way or the other usually. They either become super earthy, very Wiccan and very, the earth has everything that you need living out in nature, or they become super spiritual and they're ready to ascend and there's UFOs coming to get them and they're building crystals in their house and all this stuff. But neither of those has been the answer. Both of those paths have been going for a long time. You can't create a reality without both of those being balanced together. So you have to be completely grounded while completely open to the higher realms at the same time. And then that container is heart space. So to be able to be there, you have to have the unconditional loving heart space for yourself, one, and two, for the reality around you. And so, I call that neutral heart space. You are not polarizing necessarily. You're allowing people their processes, and the earth its process, and yourself your process. And as you do that, it builds that space and that alignment between the two. And within that, your frequency then, or what I would say your life purpose, starts shining out into what you're physically doing. And then you start making, inroads on it. It's not, I've not found that to be an instantaneous thing. I found that that's a wave of how complex your reality systems are and how much you've had to experience to get to your understanding. You have to unwind all of those things. So you'll find those pinnacle moments where, yes, you're right there in the space, and then the next day something will just sideswipe you because you still have mechanisms in place or emotional damage in place. But that's where I think if you can find in that pinnacle moment, this is my frequency, this is who I am, this is what I'm trying to manifest into the world. It's a symbolic anchor. It's almost like a light post coming from the earth to hold you steady, and then from above to give you inspiration that you then kind of lock into, if at all possible, when you're feeling thrown around. Because I think there's going to be a lot more thrown around going on. Because our shared realities are starting to disintegrate. And so we're going to have to choose which realities we want. I think we're going to have to form new groups to create different reality structures. And the repercussion of that is all these unprocessed places and all these things that we've accumulated in our experiences are getting rattled very violently because they're no longer in frequency with us. We used to kind of hide ourselves so we can pretend we're these things, and now we're not. And so they don't fit. And these people are having experiences that seem chaotic and crazy because it's mirroring back to them whether they're in alignment with their frequency or their reality. And so I think it's imperative for smoothness of transition to new realities that we find that center point to help us navigate. Because if you don't have a center point, it can be very troubling when you don't know who you are or why you're here and things are dissipating around you. And so for me, I use that light frequency as a symbolic centering thing. So even if I'm thrown out to the winds, I know this is my frequency. But for some people, it's a feeling. This feeling is my frequency. There's a feeling, there's an emotional place that's me, no matter if I'm incarnate here or not. And how am I expressing that in my life is in that life purpose, is that way of influencing your incarnation.